Hello, welcome to the Research Cat. In today's video, I want to take a look at learning, particularly the learning paradigm as is generally understood now. The chart that you see in front of you is a challenge that I gave to instructors a few years ago in a instructor in service, where I asked the instructors to fill out, do they understand how students learn? It was a college classroom, and actually they did a pretty good job on it. From here, it's been expanded a little bit. It's a little bit different, simply because my knowledge has expanded a little bit, and we've changed a few things inside of the learning paradigm. But how we learn, these are the components that are inside of it. So I wanted to give that as a presentation today, and I have a personal story at the end, which will probably become more of a rant, because I feel pretty strongly about it, and as I get older and I become more focused in the research in this area, I tend to feel strongly about it, which is really how we do our assessments for students of pretty much any age. So if you're a student, because this is really aimed, this channel is aimed at your college students, but it can also be for your educators who perhaps do assessments, or who are interested in how students learn. There's going to be reference links below, and then that way some of them are for the more academic side, and some of them are simply a little bit easier to understand for people who don't necessarily want to read the research papers, and I totally understand that. So if we just start here on learning, what are the components of learning? Well, we have three components of learning. And when we say that we're going to learn, it's more than simply getting knowledge into our brains. That's just getting the knowledge. The human brain is nothing more than a giant collector of sensory inputs. And so the very first task in learning is to acquire that information. We pull that information into our brain. But then we have to both remember it and use it. And so that becomes the process portion and the retention portion. We retain that information. And these are the three main components that, and you can see on the side, there's little side components, but there's three major components to being able to learn. We have to be able to get the information into the head. We have to be able to process, or we code that information into a way that is useful to us. And then we have to retain that information. When a student is considered smart, we're generally only talking about one area of the learning paradigm, and that's the process, because process is usually affiliated with intelligence. Retain is more considered memory, and acquire is how we get that information. So I'll run across students that will say, I'm not very smart because I'm not able to understand this. Well, if they're talking about they don't understand it from a process viewpoint, I would still argue with the underlying assumption that they're not very smart, but they are talking about intelligence. But if they're talking about they don't understand it, and they oftentimes mean they cannot get it into their brain, that actually has to do with the acquisition of knowledge, which is how we acquire the information. And usually when a student says that to me, I'll say, no, we need to change our underlying premise. Because it's not this idea of being smart or being stupid or any of these labels that we put in. And we really do a disservice as instructors labeling students. Because it's very hard to sum up this entire chart, and it's going to get a little complicated, and say that all these pieces working together we're going to boil down into a word, or even worse, a number, and say that's where you are. Because in the current understanding that we have of how a person learns, there's a lot of pieces that work together. So let's start with this intelligence. And at this point, we're really working with the process portion. So I'm going to turn off the other pieces so that we're only looking at process. As an aside, I love setting this stuff up inside of Photoshop because it's like having a whiteboard that I can very easily turn layers on and off to be able to show. So typically people will come in and they'll ask, say, you know, I saw your video, I'm surprised you use Photoshop for all of this. And I'm like, it's an interactive whiteboard. I love it. When we talk about intelligence, we're talking about intelligence from a cultural perspective. Different cultures have different definitions of intelligence. Because I've come up through the United States culture, that's the United States education system, that's what I'm talking about. It is possible that if you're looking at this video and you're in, for instance, the one of the Occidental countries, or you're, say, Japan or China or Mongolia, you're looking at a different version of intelligence than the US culture tends to use. And there's different competing theories of intelligence, because one thing is we don't really understand how the brain works. So this is a cultural understanding that is going to be based primarily on Gardner's work, but it also incorporates some of the information from Sternberg. Gardner deals with multiple intelligences, and Sternberg is the triarch of intelligence. When we're talking about intelligence in the US culture, and in fact most Western cultures, we're looking at intelligence as being able to find problems. So if people have said, geez, you're a troublemaker, or you're really good at finding problems, aren't you? Well, that's indicative of you're using your intelligence. That's an excellent thing. Of course, it's not just finding problems, it's also being able to solve those problems. But one of the things that intelligence is defined by Gardner is being able to find problems, solve problems, and identify what problems exist and where the solutions are. That's actually how we define science. If you look back into, say, a problem that we have of, I want to be able to fly, well, the problem is I don't have wings. So I have to be able to understand about air pressure, because that's how airplanes fly, is through the use of air pressure and wings, and being able to create an engine powerful enough to create that negative and positive air pressure, and be able to solve the problems. But that's not just enough. I also have to have the skill set that can identify and address those problems. In this case of this example, being able to pilot the plane. And this is how we advance and we use intelligence. And when we talk about, it's in our colloquial language in the US. Well, this task is, it's not exactly rocket science, because we have to be able to identify an issue. How do we get a rocket up into the air? We have to be able to solve the problem. How are we going to create the engine? How are we going to handle the fuel weight? Because you understand one of the problems with a rocket is the more powerful the engine, the more fuel that is needed, the heavier it becomes. And there becomes an issue where to get a really powerful engine inside of a rocket with a lot of fuel to give thrust to get away from Earth's gravity, the rocket may become too heavy. So we have to be able to solve that particular problem. And then we have to have the skill set to define and build that particular rocket. So that's intelligence. So let's come to a different aspect of this model. And let's look at how we acquire knowledge. Because arguably that comes before the intelligence portion in the learning model. I can't exercise intelligence about something that I do not know. And the first step to knowing something is I have to acquire it. Now, perhaps I acquire it through my 5 senses, which are these. I'm going to acquire it through audio, which is how I hear, smell, taste, touch, and sight, or the visual medium. And technically, there's a 6th one, which is proprioception. And that's our bodily awareness. That's proprioception deals with where my limbs are and where my spacing is in the world around us. And we're going to come back to that last one when we look at the intelligences. So if we look at this idea that we're going to acquire knowledge, well, we can acquire knowledge this way. But if we acquire knowledge for academics, we're not necessarily using smell and taste. Not generally. Perhaps I'm going to a cooking school and then taste becomes very important. Or there could be a chemistry class where smell becomes very important. But for most part, it's going to be actually based on audio, touch, and sight. So let me move some of these away, and we'll look at those 3, but we're going to look at them in how we acquire knowledge in a different medium for academics. And I presented in an earlier video VAX or VARC. There's a couple of different ways. It's a little controversial, and the reason it's controversial is it used to be, if we looked at the older learning paradigms, that the visual, audio, kinesthetic, social, that's what those 4 things are, is actually based on the entire learning model. And that's changed. It's been downgraded to the idea that actually what that model is of VAX or VARC, and VARC would be V-A-R-K, visual, audio, read, write, and kinesthetic. There's a reason I'm using this one instead, but the idea of either one of them, VAX and VARC, is that you're doing this to be able to get that information and acquire it for academic purposes. But it's no longer an entire model that I'm seeing it, and that visual becomes my capacity to learn. And when I was first started in doing instructional work, that was what I was taught. I was not actually shown the rest of this entire model. I was shown this piece up here and said, that's what you need to be able to do to teach students. It's fine that that was the paradigm, but that paradigm has now been replaced, And so teachers should now be changing over to this newer paradigm that we acquire information, we process information, we retain that information, and it's the passing back and forth between intelligence and memory that results in some sort of an application of whatever we've learned. But let's just talk for a moment here about visual, audio, kinesthetic, and social. Now, as I mentioned earlier, there is the visual, audio, read-write, and kinesthetic model. Both VAX and VARK were developed along the same lines. I'll have a link down below for it. The reason I use VAX for the social is that social media is a large part of an average student's diet of information. So the social part, your telephones, which, when I was growing up, we didn't have cell phones. We had landlines that were connected into a wall. We didn't have, until I got the cell phone, I always had a landline. I didn't even have a wireless line. So you're kind of rooted in one place when you're talking, and it wasn't as convenient as now with a cell phone. I can be out doing exercise and having a conversation. So the VAX model is a little more useful to me for the purpose of classroom instruction, and there's an article by Mueller, which I will put down below, that actually addresses the use of social media in a classroom to benefit. Mueller was actually talking about how schools should probably not be so quick to ban social media. And the reason you don't want to just put an outright ban on social media in most cases, but there are exceptions, is that you do not want to isolate whatever that is with a negative idea and never show a positive model. So as an example, cell phones in the classroom in college can become an issue. And one of the reasons they're an issue is that when the instructor is talking to people, you don't necessarily want them punching on their phone and not listening to you. I understand that, and that's fine. But we can use social information to be able to gather information. So I worked at a school. I taught the equivalent of freshmen. And in the school, they had a cell phone ban. Perfectly understandable in their particular case, because the students were learning to become medical technicians. And if they're on their cell phone, they're going to run into HIPAA problems. And in fact, that got some of the people fired essentially from the entire field before they even got started. So it's a big problem. But by having the outright ban, they also didn't learn how to use the cell phone in a positive way, which is to look up information. So sometimes I would ask the students to take out your cell phone and look this up for me, because I don't know this answer and I'm curious about it. It was some question that was answered. And then put your phones away, because now we're doing a model of how to do this. That wasn't my idea. That was actually brought about by Mueller. And Mueller has this potential way of how to use cell phones in an English class to be able to help out and show English. And there's some studies for the medical field that it's not quite enough to just say don't use the cell phones at work. Use the cell phones at work, but in this manner to help out and advance your job. So the social is, I tend to use the social more than I use the other model, and I use the read-write as both read is visual and write as the kinesthetic. So visual is both pictorial, in this particular model, pictorial and your reading. Any information that my eyes acquire is information that is going into my brain. Now, whether I can make sense of that information or not is an entirely different matter. Audio is your information that is coming to you by your hearing. Kinesthetic is your sense of touch, but it's also taking notes. So in an academic way, I will teach students sometimes, and they will take tons of notes. They might be a kinesthetic, is how they acquire information. And it doesn't really make any sense to them. They can't code it or understand it unless they're getting this information in a touch, taking notes, or one could say a proprioception that with their body enhanced to be able to use that. Other people, I'll put stuff up on the board and they don't write it down. That's fine. They'll tell me, the students would tell me, well, yes, but I'm a visual learner. And that could be quite correct. They could, taking the notes doesn't really help, but having the picture of the notes up on it, they want me to write it because they need to see it in order to best acquire it. Now, in general, people have some of all of these, excepting, for instance, if they have hard of hearing, then audio is not as useful. Or if they're blind or do not see well, visual is not as useful. And these roughly correspond with the senses. Both social and audio come into the audio sense. Kinesthetic is with touch, visual is with sight, and kinesthetic is also with this proprioception. So this is how we acquire this information. We get it into our brains. But then we're going to be moving on. Once we have it into our brains, we have to be able to use it. And that gets us back into the intelligence portion, which is how we process information. So I'm going to have the first part here disappear, and we're just going to focus on the acquiring information. Excuse me, we're just going to focus on the processing. I was like, I have to find the layer for acquire, and I'm removing it. But no, we need to focus on the process of information. Now, we talked about a little bit about what intelligence actually is from a U.S. cultural perspective, so I'll put that back up. But we're going to expand that out a little bit, looking at the multiple intelligences that Gardner introduces. And if people are interested, I can do one on the triarch intelligence, and there are a few others, but the two major ones I see in the science literature now, which is largely neuroscience literature, is multiple intelligence and the triarch of intelligence. I've selected the multiple intelligences here. It seems to be a little more popular, at least in the schools that I went through, but Gardner also talks about multiple intelligences through a biological and neuroscientific lens. And that's useful as well when we start getting into memory. So I'm going to look at how we code our information. We acquire it, and then we have to code that information into a way that becomes useful to us. Otherwise, it's just kind of sitting there. We don't know what to do with it, and it's not useful. We can't find the problem. We can't solve the problem. Maybe we can find it, but we can't quite understand what we're going to do with it. This would be me looking at Calculus 3. I can get the information from Calculus 3 into my brain, but I don't know what to do with it. So when we're looking at this kind of different types of intelligence, let's look at linguistic. Linguistic is your language. This is things like reading comprehension, being able to put sentences together, grammar, talking out problems with other people. These are all linguistic processes used to aid with our intelligence. There's musical intelligence, that some people are very good at hearing notes, hearing rhythms, recreating them, working with them, arranging words to a certain beat. And that musical intelligence maybe even goes with memory. That some people will be very musically inclined, and if they take their whatever they're learning and they can set it to music, they'll not only be able to order it in this process, but they'll be able to remember it. The alphabet for many people is introduced as a musical. You're going to sing your ABCs. I'll spare you that particular example, but you're going to sing that music, and then you're going to not only code and remember it in your memory, but you're going to code and be able to work with it in a process for your intelligence. There's the logical mathematical. This is being able to order material, being able to define a problem from point A to point B, understanding problems in numerical terms or variable terms. And again, this also connects into the memory portion, because inside of our memory, we're only going to look at 3 parts, but there's a whole bunch of other parts to memory that work. And one of those parts is sequential. We remember information in certain sequences. The alphabet is another example of sequential information. Many of us, in fact, if I was to say, well, corresponding the word cat to the numerical pad, where you have 3 letters on each of the keys starting with number 1. So A, B, and C is number 1, D, E, and F is number 2. What is cat? Well, cat would be 1, 1, and 7. And I would be able to go through that. That's a logical sequential method. And PIN numbers, for instance, for ATMs are defined that way. You'll have 4, 5, or 6, or 7 PIN numbers, and you're going to put a word there and then turn that word into a number. That's your logical mathematical process, but it's done that way also for sequential memory. There's spatial. This goes along with the proprioception. In the intelligence tests that they used to give, and I wish they wouldn't give anymore, but I know they still do, you'll have 2 shapes and you're going to create a box from those shapes. This is understanding how the world around you is shaped and how those shapes go together. That's one portion of intelligence. There's personal intelligence. Now, Gardner in Frames of Mind, talks about personal as being both extrinsic and intrinsic. That is, personal sense of self focused inwards. How well do you know yourself? He's not talking about a narcissistic personality here. That's a misunderstanding of what he's talking about. He's talking about your sense of self, in that, are you aware of yourself and how you think, how you're reacting to information, how emotionally distant you are from a problem. That's personal. Or extrinsic, in that, how aware are you of other people around and what other people's needs and wants are around you when you're interacting with them. And then there's bodily kinesthetic. Bodily kinesthetic is your sense of being able to move, being able to understand those movements. For instance, in a process of intelligence, somebody with a high bodily kinesthetic might be able to learn and understand material very well in the form of a dance or in the form of a sport. The stereotype of an athlete who is very good at sports but not very book smart and therefore not intelligent, and I run into that all the time, where teachers will tell me that sometimes, and I'll be like, I do not know what you're talking about. Because intelligence, being able to understand your body and being able to learn a set of maneuvers out on a field or a movement out in a sports arena, ice skating for instance, that's an intelligence. Maybe it's not book intelligence of visual, linguistic intelligence, musical intelligence, but it's still an intelligence. And this is the problem I have with labeling and saying that it doesn't work. Because in reality, we do not understand well enough. In Frames of Mind, Gardner talks about really 6.5 intelligences, because personal is sort of 2, but the same basic root. So this would become 6.5. Linguistic, musical, logical, spatial, bodily kinesthetic, personal, including both extrinsic and intrinsic. But in the foreword and in the other writings that he has, you can get anywhere up to 14 different intelligences. I went through a licensing exam for teaching at career schools in New York State, and they chose 8. Why they chose those 8, I have no idea. I tried to find out the information, and I could not. There's a... at the time, there were 10 basic intelligences, and New York State decided they didn't want to do 2 of them. I suspect, but I don't actually know this, and if any of you know this and you want to put it down in the answers below, I would love the answer for this. But I suspect that they did not choose the gender intelligence because, well, they don't want to get into that. And it's relatively fascinating. Some people process information, because that's what intelligence is. It's how you process your information, or at least that's the understanding that we currently have. Some people process information through this lens of their identity, their gender identity, masculine, feminine, and no one really understands why. And there's also an entire game field that is psychologists look at, where people play games and you're playing either the same gender, so I'm a male and I'm playing a male character, or I'm a male playing a female character, and how does that change my perception of the game? And there's an entire group of studies out there that are fascinating to look at this idea of how we process information. We process problems based on our gender. There's also a set where we process based on our understanding of religion and God or higher powers, or however we wish to phrase this, that we process this information based on this idea of a divinity. And I see and I understand all my information through this, and I shouldn't say all, I understand part at least of my information through this idea of connection with a universe or a higher power or my particular religion, and this is all understood as a different part. And basically we have each of these. Most people will have all of our intelligences, but we have some that we use more than others. I find it useful to think of the multiple intelligences as a lens that we put in place to order information to solve problems. But let's have this go away temporarily, and let's take a look down at the final part of the chart, which is how we retain information. Because we've acquired information, but we also have to retain that information. And this is your memory. And memory is pretty complicated. So I'm going to do a short part on memory, and if people want more, you can ask me and I'll put together some. There's some that I would have to go out and I'd have to research parts of, but I will have some links down below for going to see the different types of memory. I'm not getting into right now, for instance, episodic memory or sequential memory or haptic memory, but I'm going to stay with the basic portions here of memory, which is the higher level of memory. The sequential memory we talked about before, or episodic memory, which is being able to get that information and remember it in little blocks that we're going to use. And the memory field, as pretty much any neuroscientist or psychologist will tell you, is pretty complicated. And I'm not sure in a presentation like this I can actually do it justice. But we have short-term memory, we have long-term memory, we have sensory memory. Sensory memory is only about a second long. And you can compare it to, you see sparkles from a firework. And we say, oh wow, look at that. That's sensory memory. We convert that into short-term memory for a couple of minutes. We have a stimulus, we've acquired that stimulus, and then we retain that stimulus. Now, it doesn't mean that I have been able to process that stimulus, because memory and intelligence are separate, but they're related. Because I can't process something that I don't have inside of myself. Right? This is the old exercise that sometimes students will do with an instructor in a classroom of, if you've never seen an elephant, how do you know what an elephant looks like? If you've never seen a picture of an elephant, you have no frame of reference. There is nothing in your memory that you can call out to process what it looks like. And they usually use this as a description of how would you describe an elephant. A short-term memory is a small couple of minutes. I'm retaining it for a small amount of time. We actually retain memory typically in numerical sets. 3, 5, and 7, I believe, is the common, and you can prove this to yourself. You can do it as an exercise with say a phone number. A phone number is a group of 3 digits, the area code, and then the prefix, and then the last part. And if you go to somebody who does not know how to leave a message on an answering machine, and they'll tell me, and sometimes they'll call me and they give me each of those numbers, which is a 10-digit string, and they'll give it to me really quick. And I'm just making up a phone number here, 358-123-4568. I have no idea. I don't even know what I said. But if I break that down into 358-123-4568, I'm allowing that stimulus to go into short-term memory and be able to remember it in that numerical sequence. When somebody leaves me a 10-digit string of the phone number, the 7 digits of the phone number and the area code of 3 digits gives me the 10 digits, and they leave it to me as one long run-on numerical sequence, I'm like, well, they'll call back, because I'm not going to listen to that message 10 times to be able to write it down, because I can't even write it as fast as they're telling me the answer. But you give me the short term, and I can remember it long enough to be jotting it down as they're telling me that information. And for those of you that have worked as office assistants or secretaries or administrative aides, you've probably learned, even if you weren't taught it, you've probably learned through being able to solve problems to give a phone number or to give addresses in these short numerical sequences. If you look at your zip code is typically 5 digits. Then you got the 4 digits afterwards, which most people don't remember. Your address block is 3 lines, typically. You have your salutation line up at the top. You have your street address, and then you have your city zip. And if you look at your state, city, and zip, that's again in a block of 3. This isn't a coincidence. Bell Atlantic, back when it existed, did a lot of research because they were introducing zip codes. And they needed people to remember the phone digits. How are we going to put the phone digits out so that people can remember them? The U.S. Post Office also did a lot of early research in memory, and how are we going to get people to remember their addresses? So we retain information in these numerical sequences. Long-term memory is what people generally mean when they talk about memory, which is I'm going to retain it for maybe years. I should also mention that people will talk about muscle memory. There is really no such thing, right? Your muscles do not remember anything. Instead, your brain is encoding information that it's going to send out to your muscles. And some people are really good at retaining that type of memory. And they learn very well through the bodily kinesthetic, which is your kinesthetic up here in your acquiring, bodily kinesthetic, which is over here, proprioception, which is another type of acquiring information, and then they can retain that information in muscle memory, what we call muscle memory. So let's take a look here at this whole chart if we look from the beginning, because there's a lot of components that are working together. So we have our three major portions. We're going to acquire, we're going to process, we're going to retain. And you don't have to remember all the other pieces. But if you could remember that learning is typically acquire, process, and retain. Intelligence is cultural. Not every country, not every culture recognizes intelligence as being the same. In the US, it is typically finding, solving problems, and skills. You might have identifying problems in there as well. And under the triarch of intelligence, and sometimes referred to by Gardner's intelligences and multiple intelligences, the entire learning process goes under intelligence. When we acquire information, we acquire it by hearing. Our audio, smell, taste, touch, sight, and our body awareness of proprioception. When we process information, we've acquired that information, we're sending it to our intelligence. That means we have to be retaining it now. We're going to start working with that. Well, now we're looking at linguistic, learning, musical. Learning actually was the whole field. Let's do that again. We're looking at linguistic, musical, logical, mathematical, spatial, personal, and bodily kinesthetic. When we're acquiring information for academics, we're typically looking at visual, which is both your reading and your pictorial. We're looking at audio, which is how you hear information. This is your typical lecture format. Your kinesthetic, which is I'm learning by doing something. These are your projects, or your sports, or your physical education. I'm learning by social, talking, teaching. I'm going to talk it out with another person. Maybe the use of social media. Be careful, because if this is going up on YouTube, if you're learning through YouTube, you're looking at it visual and audio. Even though YouTube is considered social media, it's not actually interactive on the social viewpoint, in that technically it's defined as asynchronic, because you're going to leave the messages down below and I will get to them perhaps a year or two later afterwards and give you. So it's not an even flow of information. So it's really more like a TV. It's a visual and audio. And then this memory that we retain information through our short term, which is just a couple of minutes. Our sensory information, which is less than a second, and then our long-term information, all of which forms the learning process. So I was just sharing recently a story that someone had asked, one of my peers had asked me why I was so interested in this particular learning. And why do I think it's really important all the students know it? And definitely the teachers, but I think students should know this. And pretty much I teach it in the front of all of my classes in some way, whenever I give the class, pretty much on anything, because I find that people have had some bad experiences. They've been damaged sometimes. Not necessarily by the educational system. This isn't to beat on teachers. Sometimes they get just damaged by common tropes and themes that are out there that they're exposed to. and they'll believe that they're not capable of doing something that they can. So I addressed that. And I had to think about when this other instructor asked me and said, why am I so focused on this? Why do I like this so much that this is what I'm going to spend literally years studying? And I had to go away and think about that for a while. And I was talking it over with some other people, and I was like, I think it is because of a example I had in my own life. So when I was in 7th grade, I was given an official intelligence test. All the students were at my school. And then I had another one in 9th grade, and I had another one in 11th grade. And then I had a interesting meeting with a maybe well-meaning teacher, professor actually, in college. And they all kind of followed the same line. And at the time, especially in 7th grade, I was a kid. I didn't know better. But I do now, and it's more annoying now when I hear about other people who have had these same examples, these same differences. So in 7th grade, they gave this thing called an Iowa battery. And actually, if you go to the Iowa battery page, it says this is not an IQ test. I don't know what it said back in the mid-1980s, but that was, it was given as an intelligence test, and it was generally understood by the school, at least to the students, it was presented as an intelligence test. It had 3 basic components to it. Reading comprehension, which if you look on your model here is your linguistic. You had to fit these little blocks together and be able to see them, and that was basically processed by spatial. And they had logical sequences of numbers, and you had to be able to answer those logical sequence. 3, 5, 7, what's the next number? Is it 8, 9, or 10? And that looks at your logical mathematical. On the test, there was no musical, there was no tones, there was no personal interactions. We came in and we sat at a desk for 3 hours, because what 7th grader doesn't want to go to school in the morning and sit for 3 hours filling out bubble sheets? And there was no sport, bodily kinesthetic, dance, any of that kind of thing in it. And then they came up with a score, and they assigned each of us an IQ. I have to tell you, I did not do very well at it. Because of that particular instance, I was not allowed at that time to take the New York Regents test. Regents diploma in high school, because they considered my intelligence too low. At the time, I was a kid, sounded like extra work. I was okay with it. But at the same time, I was like, I don't think I'm dumber than some of the other people in class. And now I hear these stories that come from other students who come and they tell me very similar stories, and I'm like, yeah, they did you a disservice. How are you going to sum up this entire chart in a single IQ number? I mean, I see the appeal, right? I can tell a student, well, you're a 93, and you're a 102, and you're a 118, and you're a 63. So the 63 probably can't work with anyway. The 119 I can certainly work with. So I'm going to focus my attention on the 119, because they're going to be more intelligent, and the way we tend to define it in the US culture as more useful to society. And if that 63 person happened to be 150 in bodily kinesthetic and is a marvelous athlete, well, we'll never know it because we don't test it. And this isn't a problem with the IQ, it's a problem I have with assessments and how we give them in the United States. And I'm not talking just school. We assess this way sometimes in businesses too. And it's just as irritating to me there as it is in school. We assess it in colleges. I know, I work at a college. We assess sometimes and the assessments do not match what we do. I make it a point in classes that I have control over and that I teach. And I have for years that there is a project-based portion of that test. Why? Because we want a kinesthetic, a bodily kinesthetic, a touch, a proprioception, some episodic. We want some sort of different part than just reading comprehension and filling out bubbles. By the way, in 9th grade, I was given a modification to the test, to the IQ, and I sat before a psychologist. It will probably always stick in my mind because they called me out of the class as, oh, could you come to the psychologists? Because what kid doesn't want to be called over the loudspeaker to go to the psychologist? Thanks a lot. And then they gave me a reading comprehension test, what mounted to be linguistic. They did this because they thought it was the eyesight. I have pretty poor eyesight. And so they said maybe that was the problem, that I couldn't fill out those bubbles. And by the way, that is the problem. I cannot fill out those bubbles. I can't fill out those bubbles now. And I've had 2 eye surgeries and a special type of glasses. So, yes. And the reason they did it is because some observant teacher that I had in 9th grade noticed that when I write, my notebook is sideways on the desk and I write in columns up and down. And so they said, you know, maybe the problem isn't an intelligence problem, maybe it's an eyesight issue. So I took a linguistic test and they would ask questions like, how do you say the word, and they would spell it out, D-E-B-R-I-S. Well, I know now it's debris, but at the time I said debris, because that's the way it looks. Or chassis, because that's the way it looks, where it's actually chassis. I hadn't been introduced to those words. And the psychologist would say, well, I guess, you know, you're right where, we assessed you right where you're supposed to be. But think about what they're saying here. In that particular case, and again, I'm a kid, I didn't know the difference. But I do now. If I haven't acquired the information, the word debris, I haven't been introduced to it. It's not in my memory. I haven't acquired the word. I'm hearing it the first time during a test. What is this test actually testing? It's testing how familiar I am with words and how wide my language is. Well, that's not intelligence. And I'm not entirely certain how useful it is. At 11th grade, they tested again. Now, and that had been after I had some eye corrections. And they said, oh, you know, we really tested you wrong, because in actual fact, you tested much higher once we changed the test in a layout that you didn't have to fill out little bubbles. And you could have taken the Regents test, but you're in 11th grade now and it's too late. And at that point, I wasn't as much of a kid and I was angry. But I had no power, so it didn't really matter. In college, I ran into the problem that because of the way I went through high school and the degree that I got, I had never taken pre-calc. So when I went to calculus without the foundation in college, I didn't do very well, if one could imagine this. And the math teacher, probably well-meaning, took me aside and said, you know, you're not really good at math. You don't seem to have a very logical intelligence. Stay away from math. And I was really struggling with it, so I did. I avoided math for over a decade. It was kind of bad advice, because it wasn't that I didn't have a logical mathematical intelligence. It was that I didn't have the prerequisite to be able to take the class. And this is why I make sure that students understand that they are not stupid if they do not understand parts of whatever it is. You have to have a foundation. You have to have acquired the information to be able to use it. How do I know that I have a logical mathematical intelligence? Because once I had the prerequisites, as part of my doctorate program, I went through and took 700 level math with the corresponding levels below it. So yes, I could do that logical mathematical. How do I know that I'm not an idiot? Well, I have a lot of fancy letters after my name that tells me, you know, I can do work, I can find problems, I can solve problems, I can do skills. Now, I happen to be very stubborn, so when somebody tells me, and probably a little anti-authoritarian, so when somebody tells me, says, you know, I don't think you're going to be able to do this, I'll be like, I'm going to do that. So I'm sharing this with you because I find many students have these problems where they have been told things, not necessarily by education like in my case, but they've been told this by family members or by people that they look up to who mean well, but who are not necessarily understanding of how we learn, how we order information, how we code that information into our memory. And so they have a misunderstanding, these students, of what they can do. And they feel that they are not as capable of being able to do it. I don't expect everybody to want to go through the work to do a doctorate. But I do think that anybody who has a desire to become a doctor has that possibility, that potential. Or the potential to become a great athlete, or the potential to become a great musician. And those things should all be equal. This is also pre-framing for the next set of videos on this channel, which we're going to be looking at different parts of this. We're going to be looking at the acquisition of knowledge. We're going to be looking at how we research information and be able to understand it from a critical thinking perspective, which really goes down to intelligence. Looking at how we retain information. These are all important parts to not just research, but education in general. So this is a good pre-framing for a next block of videos, which will probably culminate in assessments and how we're currently doing assessments, and some of the current research in assessments that suggest maybe we're not doing assessments quite right. If you find that this was a video that was interesting to you or helpful to you, feel free to give me a thumbs up or subscribe. And If you have any questions or you have any comments that you want to share about this, you can put them down below. And if you have a topic that you would like me to cover, just put that down below as well, and I will do my best to get to it. I currently have 22 videos slated that I'm kind of working on together. And so which video will come up comes out more or less what time I get that together. And if you find a particular format useful, you can help me out by letting me know that as well. Take care.